All right, AP World History, we are on to Unit 8, which in some ways will feel like the last real history unit. Unit 9 is kind of a, well, well, I don't know, take my word for it. You'll understand when we get there. Um, doesn't feel as much as history-ish as everything else that we have covered. So there you go. Go ahead and, I don't know, little ones, you can cuddle up and I'll tell you the story here. The Cold War to get things started here in Unit 8, and then decolonization later on, okay? So let's go ahead and move it on in here. We'll kind of get you a definition and, kind of what the Cold War is and all that kind of business as we move on. But to be honest with you, first, believe it or not, we're going back to World War II again, because we didn't, get enough of that in Unit 7 in the Beast. But yeah, to really lay out some of the parameters of the Cold War, we got to do a little bit of stage setting here. And so where I'm going to jump in is I'm going to talk about three conferences, meetings that took place during the course of World War II. We talked about the Atlantic Charter back in Unit 7 when Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, the leaders of the United States and Great Britain, got together even before the United States was into the war yet, and was looking down that road of that, well, eventually the United States would be in the war, and what would be the war aims once that happened. What would happen to Europe after the war? I mean, very, very kind of all over the place conversation in terms of some really, looking down the road. Well, I'm going to talk to you about a few other meetings that go on here, okay? So the first one is going to take place in, well, here you go, there's some current events for you. Tehran, the capital of Iran. It's been undergoing a lot of recent bombing here in the military conflict that's been going on. Last about, I guess, 4 or 5 weeks. Well, in 1943, more peaceful time in Iranian history, they are the host of a conference between the three leaders you see there, which from left to right, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. So we have the British, the Americans, and the Soviets all represented there. This was a meeting that takes place about halfway through World War II, and pretty much kind of established what the goal was going to be, immediate goal for destroying, defeating Nazi Germany, and really focused on Europe, not so much talking about what's going on out in the Pacific. And the commitment was made was that the British and the United States, along with allies like the Canadians and a little bit of help from the French there, they would be in charge of freeing Western Europe. All right, liberating from Nazi control all those Western European countries that Hitler and the Nazis had conquered early on in the war. Stalin would be in charge of freeing his own country, which by 1943 he's well on the way of doing, but also then freeing and liberating Eastern Europe. Okay, and so it's kind of like they each kind of talk about, hey, these will be our areas that we're going to be in charge of as we, ramp the war up against Nazi Germany, and this idea of putting them kind of in a vice, so that you've got armies squeezing in on the Germans from both sides, which, as we learned in our last unit, contributes to eventually to the end of the war. All right. Yalta takes place in 1945 as the war is beginning to wind down. And in this one, this is where we start to see the beginnings of some differences of opinion and positioning, with the British and the Americans taking one side, and the Soviet Union kind of being out there on their own in another side. Now we're starting to talk at Yalta more about that, it's inevitable. The Nazis are, hanging on for dear life. It's only a matter of time before the war comes to an end. And at Yalta, I'm trying to remember, that photograph that I have there might be actually from Yalta, not Tehran, because I'm looking at Franklin Roosevelt in the middle there, and he was very unwell by the time of the Yalta conference. Matter of fact, he dies not too long after this, ends up suffering this massive stroke. and dying. And it was noticed that even at the Yalta Conference that he kind of rolled over a few times on some of the demands that Joseph Stalin was making, and really didn't stand up for himself, because he was, literally physically not really doing that good. But anyhow, what is discussed at this one is what's going to happen to Europe after the war. All right. And from the position of the United States and Great Britain, they believe that the first item of order should be to allow free elections in all these newly liberated countries. They've been under the Nazi yoke for 4 years, 5 years, and they should be allowed to hold free elections and bring in their own people to lead their countries again. And the British and Americans are kind of a little loosey-goosey in terms of, as far as, we're not going to get in the middle of what kind of government they want. If they want a government, obviously, if we want a Nazi government, no. Okay, they're going to draw the line somewhere. But, but they're not going to get too picky about that beyond that, whether it's going to be, more of a form of a socialist government, maybe one that's a little bit more of capitalist based, they're not going to get into that. That's for the people to decide, and that's really what they, self-determination. Let the people who have been freed determine their own course. Okay. And here's where we get the difference. Stalin is thinking down a different road. And that is that, and again, go back to folks, remember, what the Soviet Union has experienced and suffered through in this war. He wants to use Eastern Europe to create basically what he refers to as a security buffer. Okay. He is bound and determined to make sure that something like what the Germans did to his country never can happen again. And so he's not so hot on the idea of allowing those Eastern European countries to hold free elections, because he wants to hold some kind of nominal control over them and use those Eastern European countries as, like I said, this kind of like security buffer, okay? Kind of this zone to help protect himself. What's not being said out loud is really the reality that he knows, and Roosevelt and Churchill know, that this alliance that they've had through World War II has always been one that has been kind of fraught with trouble. Most of it coming from the fact that you have, coming from the United States and Great Britain, these kind of capitalist-based, democratic style, representative forms of government, and you've got authoritarian communism coming from the other side. And here's where the cracks are going to start to show, and how quickly this alliance is going to fall apart with the end of the war. Because in effect, what Stalin is saying without saying is, I think you guys are going to attack me someday. And before you get to my country, you're going to have to fight your way through these Eastern European countries first. And you're going to have to do that because I'm going to be there. I'm not leaving. The Nazis, we are going to liberate them from Nazi Germany, yes. But now we are going to control Eastern Europe, right? So for those poor Eastern European countries, what he's in effect saying is, nothing's going to change for you except you're going to have a new boss. And it's not going to be you or your people. It's going to be another outside power, this time the Soviet Union, all right? And obviously, at the conclusion of the Yalta Conference, it's going to be one of those like, well, I guess we're going to agree to disagree for right now kind of discussions, because there is no middle ground. There's no negotiation that's created out of this, all right? And then one last little tidbit there with Yalta is that Soviet Union, Stalin does agree that at the conclusion of the fighting in Europe, that he will lend military assistance to the war in Asia and the Pacific, and that specifically they'll strike first at Japan's holdings in Manchuria, and then start, fighting from there to help aid the Allied cause in the Pacific. All right, and I'm going to go take care of a dog uprising here. Hold on. Okay. Let me jump here to the last of the meetings. That is the Potsdam Conference, which I should pop up a picture here, but I don't have one. At this conference, things look very, very different. This one comes in as the war now is concluded, And with the Potsdam Conference, we have almost a completely different set of characters attending. Churchill is now gone, and the British public, when you get to the end of the war, they're pretty very quick, kind of like almost an attitude of, hey, you were great to get us through the war, but we want to go in a different direction now, and he loses power. And a new prime minister comes in. Also, we have a new president in the United States. Again, between Yalta and Potsdam, Roosevelt dies, and Harry Truman is now the president. The only person who remains through all three of these meetings is good old Uncle Joe. All right. Potsdam is where they're really trying to cement into place. Okay, the war is over. Now what do we do? And even though we have different leaders, in the West, the United States and Britain are still united in their commitment to holding free elections in Europe, right? And they are adamant that they are going to do that. And the countries that they have liberated in Western Europe, every single one of them are going to be allowed to hold their own elections. Again, they're self-determination. They're going to put words into action. Okay. Stalin is absolutely steadfast in refusing to do the same for Eastern Europe. And so, right away, there is a real sour feeling to this conference. And what a lot of historians are going to say is the direct setup for what will become the Cold War. They just are, Stalin is he's inflexible here. He just says, no, you do what you want with the West, and I'm going to do what I want with Eastern Europe. And so it's a conference that wraps up with a lot of bad feeling and a lot of foreboding about what is to come at a moment when boy, we've we're talking about VE Day is still the celebration is still kind of echoing in people's minds, and this quickly there's this big kind of dark cloud over where things are headed at the end of this massive destructive world war. Okay. All right. So what do I mean by this shifting balance of power? First of all, let's talk about Europe, or what's left of Europe. We started to talk about the beginnings of a shift in balance after World War One, where the United States finally steps out a little bit more forcefully onto the world stage. And Europe is left, kind of licking its wounds after World War One. Well, they're even in more so a situation like that at the close of World War II. The countries of Europe, including the British themselves, have suffered extensive damage. The countries have gone deeply into debt, fighting the war. You have countries like France and other Western European countries that were occupied by Germany for years, and so they are in a major having a rebuilding phase. Good large portions of Western Europe are severely damaged in the last year or so of the war, as the Allies have to push the Nazis out, and they fight. They resist. Fighting usually mile by mile as they give up territory, and so there is extensive damage, and Europe is definitely in a situation where the time it's going to take to rebuild, the incredible expense is something for them to have to try to grapple with. Right, and then beyond that, they're thinking about their old empires, and their colonies. That they still have. France is now trying to reclaim their colonies that had become very, very kind of questionable as to how they were operating during those war years when they were under German control. So you got a lot of that stuff all in the mix as well. And now you have the very beginnings already going on of this growing rivalry between us and the Soviet Union, which really starts to come into sharp focus between those last two conferences that are held. And it is clear coming out of the end of this war that there is some kind of less than friendly feeling between them. And remember, folks, in the background of all of this, don't forget that Russian Civil War, All right, we'll take you back. All right, late teens, early 20s, when that civil war breaks out, and you had the whites versus the reds, the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, and the United States and Britain, were the two countries that were fighting against the Soviet Union. Both countries sent in small, but sent in contingents of troops to fight against them. And so when we think about why is Stalin so paranoid about Eastern Europe and a buffer and all that, I mean, he remembers that he's not that he's not that young, and he was one of the active leaders of the Bolsheviks when all of that was going down, and so he knows these guys have come at us before, and now that we've got the greater threat of Nazi Germany out of the way, they're probably coming back after us again. So, we have that as kind of the foundation for that rivalry. All right, so the start of what will be known as the Cold War. Cold War, we call it a Cold War because it is the opposite of a hot war. World War II was very much a hot war. The combatants, the different sides involved, were in direct combat with each other. They were doing everything in their power to physically destroy each other. Okay, the Cold War is going to be a war fought over the course of about 40 years, and the two main combatants that I just mentioned up there above will never directly go to war with each other. All right. Instead, they are going to fight a war that is going to be fought with propaganda and, just messaging of their people through everything from, government publications, movies, music, you name it, okay? They are going to fight through espionage, spying against each other, trying to dig up information, whether it's information on, nuclear technology or trying to dig up dirt on, different leaders, things like that. It's going to be fought through the course of an arms race, where as both of these countries develop nuclear technology, they're going to try to outbuild each other in terms of the nuclear weaponry that they have and other kinds of weapons as well. And then it's also going to be a war that's going to be fought through what we call proxy wars. And we'll get into what that is all about a little later on here. But proxy wars will be another major part of this, where the two sides will support other smaller countries that are at war with other countries or at war with themselves. And the United States and Soviet Union will step in to supply material support, sometimes logistical support, to help out countries that are at war with each other. But again, we'll dive a little bit deeper into proxy wars a little later. Proxy, Proxy. Okay, there we go. And then, of course, kind of overshadowing all of this is going to be the development of the bomb. When World War II ends, the United States will be the only country on Earth that possesses atomic, / nuclear technology. But as we will learn, the Soviet Union will be right on our heels in terms of developing it on their own. All right, where are we going to go from here? I'll just throw this as a quick aside because we are still focused mainly on the Cold War itself. But we will start to see, shortly after the end of World War II, that these European countries are going to start the process of finally beginning to lose their colonial empires. There's going to be this new emphasis coming out of the end of World War II. Think about those conferences about this concept of self-determination. You're also going to end up having the economics of running these empires, which is going to look very different post-World War II than it looked, even post-World War I. And even then, that is dramatically different than when we go back to the glory days, and I use that term lightly, of imperialism back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Okay, so that will also be kind of a side feature of the Cold War, even though decolonization is the second part of this this whole unit. Okay, so let's dig in here a little deeper into the Cold War, and by doing so, we need to talk about the United Nations. This is going to be the new and improved League of Nations that had been, put into place after World War I, and never was very successful as an organization. It had uneven membership. It had no way of enforcing any decisions that it made. All it could do is pretty much kind of, beg and plead with member countries to try to follow the international rules. It was destined for failure from the very beginning. And so the United Nations, which actually is chartered in the last months of World War II, is seen as kind of it's kind of like, I don't know, version 2. And its charter is designed to create an organization that, by its very nature, will be more successful than that of the League of Nations. And we'll get into some examples of that before we get finished up here with this unit of what I mean by that. Okay. Let's see. Also playing a role in this Cold War is going to be just layers and layers of rivalry. Between what I'm going to sometimes be referring to as the West versus the East, or just going back to that U.S.-Soviet rivalry. You are going to see a major facet of the Cold War being competition and conflict between two very different systems. Whether we're thinking this, right now, I'm looking here is that this is the economics of the Cold War. And coming from the West, yes, very much, our embrace of the capitalist system. It'll be us, it'll be our Western European allies. And, we are up against, the communist model of that, trying to achieve that idea of everyone getting everything they, what you want, what you need, no extremes in terms of, poverty and wealth, kind of making this kind of workers' world paradise kind of a thing, right? And then you also have the political aspect of that rivalry, where you have those Western European countries and the United States. Again, what I'm going to keep referring to as the West, okay? And when I start just generally using that term, please, in your mind, you're thinking the United States and Canada and Western Europe, that kind of thing, all right? Because I don't want to have to keep going back and saying, okay, that's what I mean. And those are all countries that all, adhere to various types of democracy. And then you've got, of course, authoritarianism coming out of the Soviet Union because they're still stuck in that, the dictatorship phase of communism, still waiting for the perfect communism that Marx promised that, spoiler alert, it's never going to come. All right. And then let's see, moving on from there, looking at this in more of a kind of an international kind of a scope. Let's think of it this way. That buffer that Stalin wanted in Eastern Europe, this is what will eventually be referred to these Eastern European countries as satellite countries. Okay. And what it's a reference to is that all of them are going to politically be very, very directly controlled to the Soviet Union. All right. They will all end up having leaders, and most of them will have leaders who on their face are people who are from that country. Okay. They're from Czechoslovakia. They're from Hungary. They're from, you go right down the list. But they have all been hand selected by the Soviets to do basically Stalin's bidding. Okay. Some people also call them puppet states. And they say that as a reference to that the Soviet Union and the leader himself, Stalin, is like the puppet master, and then the countries, the Eastern European countries themselves, are going to do whatever he directs them to do as the puppet master. So whichever way you think of it, I think satellite states is the way that College Board is mainly going to refer to it as. So that's kind of what I want you to be aware of. As they see the different countries as satellites of the Soviet Union, okay? And so it is very, very direct control that they use. And yes, all of these Eastern European countries will be utilizing a form of communism, okay? from Poland right on down. All right. They will all use that as their form of government because, again, they don't have self-determination. They'll be doing what they're told to do. All right. And let's see, from there, moving on in, we are going to see revolutions that will spin off from all of this. We'll get back to what's going on in China, but then we'll look at revolutions that take place in other places. Some of this is going to be communist revolution, and there's definitely a certain element of what Stalin and the communists. I mean, this goes all the way back to Lenin, even where they have what they see as a mission to spread communism around the world. And eventually we'll see it make its way all the way here to the Western Hemisphere. All right. Let's see. Next one on the list. And I'm just kind of going through a little laundry list here of all this. So containment. Containment is a political philosophy that will first be talked about by the West, but then will also be taken on by the communists as well. And it's the idea of trying to contain the spread of a political philosophy, right? So when the West first applies it, kind of take a look at the illustration here, right? So the West represented here by Uncle Sam, the most powerful country in the West, and that we are trying to kind of like minimize and isolate the influence of the Soviet Union, represented by the cute little bear there. Okay, always is, always is. The bear, and us, we've always end up with kind of like Uncle Sam, things like that, right? But we are using all of our allies to try to make sure that the Soviet Union cannot spread its government influence. Okay, don't worry, the Soviet Union was going to have the same kind of idea, saying, yeah, well, we're going to contain all of your crazy capitalism and democracy, and we're going to try to keep that from spreading. And so you've got that going on, and that is also that is definitely something that is a post-war way of looking at the world. And then from there we go to the Truman Doctrine. This is a proclamation, more or less, that Harry Truman, President Truman, makes in 1947. And what he's offering in this is, again, looking at the destruction across Europe, and the United States will provide money, will provide military aid to any country that is worried about communism spreading into their land, into their country itself. Basically to say that, as you're trying to rebuild yourself from all the damage, all the destruction, and you're concerned that in that process, you're going to end up with a communist problem in your country, don't worry. Uncle Sam is here to help you out. Okay, if you need guns to defend yourself from communism, we're passing out the guns. If you need financial aid to help with that, we've got the bucks to spend. Okay, that is what the Truman Doctrine is, and it's part of containment, right? But it's putting U.S. power, financial power, military power behind that philosophy of containment. All right, and then from there, taking even a next step, is the Marshall Plan that is also announced in 1947, named after George Marshall. Don't quote me on that name. I'm pretty sure it's George Marshall, who was the general who was pretty much overseeing a lot of the basically rebuilding efforts going on in Europe, and especially taking a look at what's going on in Germany, which will be a whole other story that we'll get to later on. Won't fit into these notes. But the Marshall Plan was the United States investing $12 billion, and this is 1947 dollars. Big. This is a huge outlay of money. Investing $12 billion to rebuild Europe. Okay. Now, when we say that, we mean everything. Western Europe, Eastern Europe, any country that suffered significantly under World War II, under the Nazi control, under the the fighting that went on, and we are willing to do that, for anyone. Stalin refuses on behalf of the Eastern European countries to take advantage of any of that money. And so most of it is going to end up being spent in Western Europe. But what it does is, it's kind of like a huge showing of goodwill from the United States. And, we see it as another way of shoring up Western Europe from any incursion from any more spread of communism. We see that there's little communist parties forming up in France and and in other countries. I think there's a little communist party forming up in Britain. We don't want to see them grow in power. And so the Marshall Plan, us spending this money, it's not a loan. It's like, here, we'll spend it. Is our way of trying to make sure that countries view us as helping them out, and that'll just be a little bit of pushback on communism. All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish off this slide here, and yeah, more or less. Okay, so let's also another aspect of the Cold War is going to be what we call the space race. All right, which is going to be just the way it sounds. Who's going to be the first to get an unmanned satellite into space, and then who's going to be the first to get a manned spacecraft into space, and eventually who's going to be the first to get to the moon? That kind of thing. Okay, so as scientists, and we're looking skywards, we're going to find, folks, that almost everything during the Cold War turns into a competition. We're going to see it, again, militarily, geographically. Politically, scientifically, we'll see it in the sports world, okay, in the Olympics, things like that. Yeah, everything is a competition during the Cold War, all right? And then the arms race itself there that will be trying to outdo each other in the building up of military weapons and arms, okay? We'll find with the space race that actually will be the Soviet Union that's going to be the leader for quite a while. The United States can be constantly being embarrassed and humiliated by the Soviet Union. We will have scientists working on putting together an unmanned satellite to get into space and to orbit the Earth. And we're cruising along with that in the 1950s, thinking that, we're probably light years away from the Soviet Union in terms of our development. I mean, come on, we're the first one to develop the atomic bomb. We're better at all this kind of stuff. Wrong-o, all right? The Soviet Union stuns us, the world, by launching Sputnik in 1957, and there's a picture of it. Looks like a metal beach ball with big sticks coming out of it. Yeah, but that thing orbits the planet, and little beep 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 sounds as it goes around. That people are out there with their binoculars at night, even here in the United States, going, "Yep, there it goes." Those commies, yeah, and then they beat us again. They're the first to put an astronaut into space. Well, I think that is in 1960, where they are able to get an astronaut into space and to orbit the planet. We will not finally take them out in the space race until 1969, when we are the first to land a crew on the moon. All right, unless you're one of those strangeoids that believe that was staged. We're not going to talk about that. All right, another aspect. Well, this connects back to the arms race. MAD, mutually assured destruction. Okay, mutually assured destruction is the idea, is the insanity of the arms race of nuclear weaponry that took place from the 1950s right on through to the end of the Cold War in 1990, and shows some signs of maybe restarting now here in the 21st century. But what it means is that with nuclear weapons, both sides in the Cold War will realize that to fight a general war using nuclear weapons, no one will win. The weaponry itself will destroy the planet. A general exchange of nuclear weapons will destroy our atmosphere, and basically a nuclear winter will descend on the entire planet. Nothing will live. Humans, animals, plants, maybe cockroaches, maybe. And so mutual assured destruction is kind of what is going to keep the two sides from going to war with each other. I mean, it is madness, okay? And that's where you get the MAD acronym there, is that we're going to spend billions of dollars building these massive stockpiles of weapons to never use them, because we know if we use them, it's the end of everything. Okay? Like I said, it's madness. All right, let me finish off this little slide here. Now, during the war, there is going to be a bunch of countries that are going to be kind of like, all right, this is insanity, and we don't want to get caught in the middle of all these, arms races and everything. And they are going to form up what ends up being called, like you see it there, the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement is going to be basically just this idea of countries that say, we're not choosing a side on this because we don't believe in this idea of the stockpiling of weapons that could destroy the planet and kill us all. And so you'll see kind of the beginnings of like almost like an anti-nuke movement that will kind of peak out in the 1980s. But it starts getting countries that don't want to choose a side, because there is going to be a lot of pressure. Get on side with, communism, or get on side with the forces fighting against communism. And there's going to be some countries saying, we choose a third option, and that is to do our own thing. All right, and now effects of the Cold War, which I will just get into a little bit of a start here. Matter of fact, I'm only going to do the first one here, and that is those proxy wars that we were talking about, okay? So, like I said, a proxy war is a war between other nations that are supported by the major powers. And in this case, usually the United States or the West, and then on the other side, the Soviet Union, okay? And so later on, when we start learning about the Korean War, the Vietnam War, things like that, those are going to be proxy wars because really, if those wars were to be fought by the two main sides that really, were going after each other, they would have been wars against the United States and the Soviet Union. But instead, we're going to fight using other countries, and sometimes we'll be militarily involved, but never directly against each other. Because if that happens, then it could blow up into something bigger, and it could turn into a nuclear war, and then we have mutually assured destruction, and it's game over for everyone. Okay, you see where I'm going with that. All right, like I said, I'm going to hit the brakes there because from this point on, we're going to start getting into the story of Germany after World War II, and that is a whole big other, box of yarn. So that'll be waiting for us next time. Okay, all right. Until next time, take it easy.